We're going to perform the Berg balance scale. In order to perform the Berg, you need a patient with a gait belt, you need a timer, a ruler, about an 8-inch step, you need a chair with armrests and a chair without armrests. Item 1, we're going to be doing sit to stand. I want you to stand up from the chair without using your arms.
For the Berg balance scale, a patient is able to score up to 4 points for each item if they complete the task appropriately. For item 1, if a patient is able to stand without using their hands and stabilizes independently, they would receive a 4. If a patient is able to stand independently but requires the use of their hands, they would score a 3. If a patient is able to stand using their hands after several tries, they would receive a 2. If a patient needs minimal aid to stand or to stabilize, they would score a 1. And if a patient requires moderate or maximal assistance to stand, they would score a 0.
Item 2 is standing unsupported. We are going to stand here unsupported for 2 minutes.
On item 2, if a patient is able to stand safely for 2 minutes, they would receive a 4. If a patient is able to stand for 2 minutes with supervision, they would receive a 3. If they are able to stand for 30 seconds unsupported, they would receive a 2. If they need several tries to stand for 30 seconds unsupported, they would receive a 1. And if they're unable to stand for 30 seconds unsupported, they would receive a 0.
Now we're going to do item 3, sitting unsupported. Go ahead and cross your arms across your chest for me. We're going to sit here for 2 minutes.
For item 3, if a patient is able to sit safely and securely for 2 minutes, they would receive a 4. If the patient is able to sit for 2 minutes under supervision, they would receive a 3. If they are able to sit for 30 seconds, they would receive a 2. If they are able to sit for 10 seconds, they would receive a 1. And if they are unable to sit without support for 10 seconds, they would receive a 0.
Now we're going to do item 4, standing to sitting. Please sit down.
For item number 4, if a patient sits safely with a minimal use of their hands, they would score a 4. If a patient controls the descent by using their hands, they would receive a 3. If the patient uses the back of their legs against the chair to control their descent, they would receive a 2. If a patient sits independently but has an uncontrolled descent, they would score a 1. If a patient needs assistance in order to sit, they would receive a 0.
Now we're going to do item 5, transfers. I want you to transfer from this chair with armrests to this chair without armrests and back again.
On item 5, if a patient is able to transfer safely with a minor use of their hands, they would score a 4. If a patient is able to transfer safely with a definite need of their hands, they would score a 3. If a patient is able to transfer but requires verbal cueing and or supervision, they would score a 2. If a patient needs one person to assist them, they would score a 1. If a patient needs 2 people to assist them or supervision for safety, they would score a 0.
Now we're going to do item 6, standing unsupported with your eyes closed. I want you to stand unsupported with your eyes closed for 10 seconds. Great job.
On item 6, if a patient is able to stand for 10 seconds safely, they would score a 4. If they are able to stand for 10 seconds but require supervision, they would score a 3. If a patient is able to stand for 3 seconds, they would score a 2. If a patient is unable to keep their eyes closed for 3 seconds but stays safely, they would score a 1. If a patient needs help to keep from falling, they would score a 0.
Now we're going to do item 7, standing with your feet together, unsupported. I want you to put your feet together and then stand unsupported.
On item 7, if a patient is able to place feet together independently and stand for 1 minute safely, they would score a 4. If the patient is able to place their feet together independently and stand for 1 minute but requires supervision, they would score a 3. If a patient is able to place their feet together independently but is unable to hold for 30 seconds, they would score a 2. If a patient needs help to attain the position but is able to stand for 15 seconds with their feet together, they would score a 1. If a patient needs help to attain the position and is unable to hold for 15 seconds, they would score a 0.
Now we're going to perform item 8, reaching forward with an outstretched arm while standing. I want you to lift your arms to 90 degrees, and then I want you to reach forward as far as you can.
On item 8, if a patient can reach forward confidently 25 centimeters or 10 inches in front of them, they would score a 4. If a patient can reach forward 12 centimeters or 5 inches safely in front of them, they would score a 3. If a patient can reach forward 5 centimeters safely or 2 inches safely, they would score a 2. If a patient reaches forward but requires supervision, they would score a 1. If a patient loses their balance while trying or requires external support, they would score a 0.
Now we're going to perform item 9, picking up an item from the floor from a standing position. I want you to pick up the shoe that is placed in front of your feet.
On item 9, if a patient is able to pick up a slipper or a shoe safely and easily, they would score a 4. If the patient is able to pick it up but requires supervision, they would score a 3. If the patient is unable to pick up the slipper but reaches 2 to 5 centimeters from it and keeps balance independently, they would score a 2. If a patient is unable to pick it up but requires supervision while trying, they would score a 1. If a patient is unable to pick it up and requires assistance to keep from losing balance or falling, they would score a 0.
Now we're going to do item 10, turning to look over your left and right shoulders. I want you to turn and look over your left shoulder and then repeat to the right.
On item 10, if a patient looks behind from both sides and weight shifts well, they would score a 4. If a patient looks behind one side only and the other side shows less of a weight shift, they would score a 3. If a patient only turns sideways but maintains their balance, they would score a 2. If a patient needs supervision when turning, they would score a 1. If a patient needs assistance to keep from losing balance or falling, they would score a 0.
Now we're going to do item 11, turning 360 degrees. I want you to turn in a full circle, and then I want you to repeat it in the other direction.
On item number 11, if a patient is able to turn 360 degrees safely in 4 seconds or less, they would score a 4. If the patient is only able to turn 360 degrees safely on one side in 4 seconds or less, they would score a 3. If a patient is able to turn 360 degrees safely but does it in more than 4 seconds, they would score a 2. If a patient needs close supervision or verbal cueing, they would score a 1. If a patient needs assistance while turning, they would score a 0.
Now we're going to complete item 12, placing alternate feet on step stool. I want you to reach up and place your feet alternating on the step stool. Each foot should touch the stool 4 times. 2, 2, 3, 4.
On item number 12, if a patient is able to stand independently and safely and completes 8 steps in 20 seconds, they would score a 4. If a patient is able to stand independently and completes 8 steps but requires longer than 20 seconds, they would score a 3. If a patient is able to complete 4 steps without aid with supervision, they would score a 2. If a patient is able to complete more than 2 steps but requires minimal assistance, they would score a 1. If a patient needs assistance to keep from falling or is unable to try, they would score a 0.
Now we're going to complete item 13, standing unsupported with one foot in front. I want you to place one foot in front of the other and stand unsupported. If you cannot get your heel to your toe, you can just put them close.
On item number 13, if a patient is able to hold in tandem stance with one foot placed in front of the other for 30 seconds independently, they would score a 4. If a patient is unable to assume the tandem stance position, but is able to keep the feet close and hold for 30 seconds, they would score a 3. This requires that one foot must be completely in front of the other, and the step width should be no wider than their shoulders. If a patient is able to take a small step independently and hold for 30 seconds, they would score a 2. If a patient needs help to step but can hold for 15 seconds, they would score a 1. If a patient loses balance while stepping or standing, they would score a 0.
Now we're going to complete item 14, standing on one leg unsupported. I want you to stand on one leg and do not let your lifted leg touch your standing leg for as long as you can.
On item number 14, if a patient is able to lift their leg independently and hold for at least 10 seconds, they would score a 4. If a patient is able to lift their leg independently and hold for 5 to 10 seconds, they would score a 3. If a patient is able to lift their leg independently and hold for 3 or more seconds, they would score a 2. If a patient tries to lift their leg and is unable to hold for 3 seconds but remains standing independently, they would score a 1. If a patient is unable to try or needs assistance to prevent falling, they would score a 0. The Berg Balance Scale is validated to assess the fall risk in numerous musculoskeletal and neurological conditions. However, generally, a score of 56 indicates functional balance. A score of less than 45 indicates an individual may be at a greater risk for falling. For those with a history of falls and a Berg Balance score of less than 51 and no history of falls and a Berg Balance score of 42 is predictive of falls. A score of less than a 40 on the Berg Balance scale is associated with an almost 100% fall risk. In older adults living in a nursing home, a score of less than a 47 indicates that a patient is at risk for falls, and in a mixed group of older adults, a cutoff score of 45 out of 56 is also indicative of a fall risk.